Think back to being 14 years old. You're probably doing something, mildly rebellious.
Oh, absolutely. Testing the boundaries is practically a universal human developmental stage. You push against the rules just to see what happens.
Right, exactly. Sneaking out, maybe talking back to your parents or defacing some school property with a marker. Just typical teenager stuff.
Yeah, harmless stuff mostly.
Well, for a kid named Moawiyah Siasna,
Mm-hmm.
living in the southern Syrian city of Daraa in February 2011, testing the boundaries meant grabbing a can of spray paint.
Right.
He and his friends had been watching the news, and the Arab Spring was just everywhere. Protesters in Tunisia and Egypt were suddenly overthrowing these heavily entrenched dictatorships.
It really felt like revolution was just in the air at that moment.
It did. So Moawiyah spray-painted a mocking message on his school wall. He wrote, "It's your turn, doctor."
A simple, almost flippant sentence that completely changed the trajectory of the 21st century.
Yeah, and the doctor he was talking about was Syrian President Bashar al-Assad.
Who is actually a trained ophthalmologist, right? He studied in London.
Exactly. So Moawiyah thought this was just a teenage prank. But he couldn't have known that this single sentence would ignite a decade-long civil war.
It's staggering to think about.
It really is. A conflict resulting in over 400,000 deaths, the rise of ISIS, and a massive shift in global geopolitics.
It is the ultimate tragic butterfly effect. Usually teenage rebellion gets you a week of detention. It doesn't trigger a multinational proxy war and, shift the global world order.
No, it really
Right.
doesn't. And that is the mission of our deep dive today. We are taking our source documents and unpacking the domino effect of how one incredibly localized teenage act of defiance shattered an entire nation.
I'm ready.
Okay, let's unpack this.
So to understand why a spray-painted wall caused such a massive explosion, we really have to look closely at the powder keg it was painted on.
Right, because Syria in 2011 was an incredibly complex pressure cooker.
Exactly. And it starts fundamentally with its demographics.
Yeah, so you have a population that is roughly 74% Sunni Muslim and about 16% Shia. But the power dynamic is completely inverted.
Right, the Sunni-majority was definitely not in charge.
Not at all. Since 1970, Syria had been ruled by the Assad family, who are Alawites, which is a branch of Shia Islam. So you have a very small minority ruling over a vast majority.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it explains the absolute paranoia of the Syrian state. When a 16% minority holds on to power over a 74% majority for 40 years, it requires systematic, deeply entrenched control.
Yeah.
It started with Bashar's father, Hafez al-Assad. He was the head of the Syrian Air Force and executed a coup in November 1970. And he knew his position was precariously unbalanced.
So he essentially starts coup-proofing his government from day one.
Precisely. He spent decades fortifying his position. He placed fellow Shias in, every single critical government and military role.
Just locking down the power structure.
Yeah, but more importantly, he built a massive overlapping intelligence network. He created multiple secret police forces whose entire job was to monitor everyone, especially in Sunni-majority areas.
And they even monitored each other, right?
Oh, absolutely.
That.
He rewrote the Constitution, silenced the opposition, and completely controlled the media.
So by the time he died in 2000, Syria wasn't just a country. It was basically a family business.
That's a good way to put it.
And then his son Bashar takes over. And from what the sources show, there was actually a lot of hope at first, right?
There really was. He was young, he was Western educated, he was the so-called doctor. People genuinely thought he might be the reformer they had been waiting for.
But those hopes were extinguished very quickly.
Very quickly. Bashar didn't dismantle his father's suppressive system at all. He just modernized it.
Never find it.
Exactly. The favoritism, the intense surveillance, the crackdowns on political speech, they all continued without missing a single beat.
So you have all this simmering political resentment, but then nature steps in and acts as a massive accelerant.
Yes, the drought.
Right. Between 2006 and 2010, Syria experienced the most devastating drought in its modern history. We hear a lot about climate change in the abstract today, but this is a tangible, horrifying example of what climate-driven collapse actually looks like on the ground.
It was absolute devastation.
Crops utterly failed. Livestock died in mass numbers. Millions of people in rural areas lost their entire livelihoods and were forced to migrate into overcrowded cities, which pushed them into extreme poverty.
And the government offered essentially zero help.
None.
That environmental catalyst is so crucial here. Extreme poverty and hunger transform abstract political grievances into desperate, immediate survival instincts.
Yeah.
By 2011, the people weren't just angry about censorship or, lack of voting rights. They were starving.
They were broke.
Right. They were watching the children go hungry while the ruling class lived comfortably.
It makes me think of managing a highly pressurized boiler with a broken release valve. The political resentment was the intense heat, but the drought was the fuel that brought it to a boiling point.
That's a perfect analogy.
And right at that moment of maximum desperation, the Arab Spring begins. The Syrian people see dictators in Tunisia and Egypt falling and think, if they can do it, why can't we?
Well, and Bashar al-Assad is watching those exact same news broadcasts, and he is terrified.
I bet.
He understands that his minority government is incredibly vulnerable to a populist uprising. So he puts his security forces on extreme high alert with a mandate to crush any dissent immediately. Zero tolerance.
Which brings us directly back to Muawiyah and that graffiti in Daraa.
Yes.
The local security chief was a man named Atif Najib, who happened to be a relative of Bashar al-Assad.
Right.
When he saw that mocking message on the school wall, he didn't see a teenage prank. He saw the spark of a revolution, and he decided to make an absolute terrifying example of these kids.
So on February 27, 2011, security forces descended on the school. They arrested 15 students, including Muawiyah, just kids. And the methods they used on them were horrific. The sources detail how they hung them by their wrists. They shocked them with electricity. They ripped out their fingernails.
God, it's just so hard to hear. And when the desperate parents went to the police station to beg for their children's release, Atif Najib didn't just turn them away.
Yeah, he didn't.
He delivered a deeply dehumanizing insult. He told these begging parents to forget their kids, go home, and make new ones.
It's unbelievable.
And then he added that if they couldn't manage to make new ones, they should bring their wives to the security forces, and the security forces would do it for them.
Just unimaginably cruel.
I am really struggling to wrap my head around this. From a purely strategic standpoint, why would a regime that is already terrified of a mass uprising deliberately provoke its citizens with such a deeply personal, honor-violating insult? Wasn't that tactical suicide?
It looks like tactical suicide to us, absolutely. But it speaks directly to the psychology of authoritarian terror.
How so?
Regimes like Assad's rely on an invisible wall of absolute fear. The internal logic is that if you respond to a minor infraction with unimaginable brutality and humiliation, you break the spirit of the people so completely that they never dare to challenge you again.
Oh, I see.
You teach them that resistance brings apocalyptic consequences to their families.
But Najib completely miscalculated the breaking point.
He did. He totally miscalculated. He didn't break them. He pushed the parents of Daraa past the point of fear and into sheer rage.
Yeah, you cross a line like that.
Exactly. When you violate a community's honor that deeply, especially a community that is already starving and desperate, the wall of fear evaporates, survival instincts kick in, and there's just nothing left to lose.
And that outrage mobilized the masses. People in Daraa began to protest, and initially it was entirely peaceful. They simply wanted their kids back.
Right.
But the government responded with more arrests. And as word of the torture leaked out, the protests spread to other cities. By mid-March, people in Damascus, Aleppo, Homs, and Latakia were all taking to the streets.
The regime eventually realized its heavy-handed approach in Daraa was generating way too much heat. So in mid-April, after 45 days of brutal detention, they finally released the boys.
They probably thought this would calm the waters.
They did, but it had the exact opposite effect.
Because the public could now physically see the torture. These boys couldn't walk properly, they were covered in scars, their fingernails were visibly missing.
It was undeniable proof.
Localized grief instantly became national rage. On April 22, 2011, which became known as the Friday of Dignity, the demands shifted entirely.
It wasn't about releasing the boys anymore.
No. The thousands of people pouring into the streets were demanding the absolute end of the Assad regime.
And that is the moment the state's mask of restraint completely slipped. On April 25, the government opened fire on the crowds with live ammunition.
Just firing into the crowd.
Yes. And when people gathered the next day to bury the dead, the military deployed tanks and helicopters against the funerals. The orders were clear: stop the crowds at any cost, using lethal force.
The brutality just compounded exponentially. The government even turned the medical system into a weapon. which is wild to me.
That was a particularly grim tactic.
They stationed secret police in hospital wards to arrest any injured protesters who came in seeking treatment. If you got shot at a protest, you couldn't call an ambulance.
Because the ambulance took you straight to an interrogation cell.
Right. So, to avoid being thrown in prison while bleeding out, civilians turned the Al-Assad Mosque into a secret field hospital. Volunteer doctors treated the wounded there.
Until the security forces discovered it.
They attacked the mosque, killing both the patients and the doctors. But here's where it gets really interesting. The regime's strategy to squash the rebellion by doing horrific things like attacking hospitals actually united the opposition and started fracturing its own military.
This is a crucial turning point, because the Syrian army wasn't just made of Alawite loyalists. Many of the rank-and-file soldiers were Sunnis.
Right, the majority demographic.
Exactly. And they were suddenly being ordered by their commanders to gun down their own neighbors, to fire on unarmed crowds in their own hometowns.
I can't even imagine being in that position.
Some soldiers refused those orders, and the sources note they were executed on the spot by their superiors. But others managed to defect, taking their weapons with them.
And these military defectors, led by officers like al-Assad, realized that peaceful protests were just getting innocent civilians slaughtered.
They saw the writing on the wall.
So on July 29, 2011, they officially formed the Free Syrian Army. Their stated goal was to fight back, protect the civilian population, and remove Assad by military force. This is the definitive point of no return.
Yes, the protest movement officially transforms into an armed civil war. The formation of the Free Syrian Army fundamentally shifted the conflict's identity from a civil rights movement to an armed struggle for sheer survival.
And once that happens, everything changes.
It does, because the moment the conflict militarized, a massive geopolitical power vacuum opened up. The entire world looked at the chaos in Syria and decided to step into the ring to fight for their own strategic interests.
It reminds me of a neighborhood block party that turns into a massive, destructive brawl, where people from 3 towns over show up just to settle their own unrelated scores right in your living room.
That's a great way to visualize it. To take your block party analogy a step further, imagine the original homeowners who threw the party are now locked in the basement, while heavily armed strangers are burning the house down to spite each other.
Wow. Yeah, that's exactly it.
What's fascinating here is how quickly the Syrian people lost control of their own revolution and became mere collateral damage in a proxy war. Superpowers and regional rivals started using the Syrian landscape as a stage.
Let's break down who is actually in this fight. You had Sunni-majority countries like Saudi Arabia and Qatar funneling money and weapons to the Sunni-led Free Syrian Army, right?
Right. They were hoping to replace Assad with a government allied to their interests.
But then Iran steps in. They are a Shia powerhouse, and Assad is their most critical Arab ally. If Assad falls, Iran loses its strategic foothold in the Middle East.
So they go all in. They send military advisors, advanced surveillance tech, and eventually their own boots on the ground to protect his regime.
And then Russia enters the arena. They had deep historical ties to the Assad family, but more importantly, they had crucial strategic interests, specifically a major naval base in the Syrian port city of Tartus.
Which is huge for them. It's their only warm-water naval facility in the Mediterranean.
So they were determined not to let a pro-Western revolution succeed and jeopardize that military asset.
Exactly.
Okay, so I'm struggling to understand the United States strategy here. If the Obama administration explicitly stated they wanted Assad gone, and the CIA was actively running programs to train the Free Syrian Army, why not just go all in? What were they so afraid of?
They were paralyzed by the fear of the vacuum.
What do you mean?
The U.S. looked at the situation and asked, if we help topple Assad, who actually takes over? They were terrified of repeating the mistakes of Iraq, where removing a dictator led to total destabilization.
Oh, right.
So the CIA's program to train and arm the moderate rebels was incredibly cautious and strictly limited. They gave them just enough support to survive, but never enough to actually win.
And that lack of overwhelming support for the moderate rebels created a massive opening for extremists. The sources note over 1,000 small militant groups emerged, totaling over 100,000 fighters.
A completely chaotic battlefield.
How does an insurgency get hijacked that quickly?
It comes down to basic logistics and funding. The Free Syrian Army was desperately under-resourced. They had soldiers who barely had enough bullets for a single firefight.
Oh, wow.
Meanwhile, extremist factions had vastly superior funding networks and sophisticated weapons smuggling routes. The moderate rebels were forced into alliances of convenience with radical elements simply to survive the government's onslaught.
Which opened the door for something even worse.
I see.
Right. The Islamic State of Iraq looked across the border, saw the absolute chaos in Syria, and saw a golden opportunity. They had battle-hardened fighters, they started securing illicit oil revenue, and they crossed the border to exploit the vacuum.
They aggressively swallowed up territory. They pulled desperate recruits away from the starving moderate groups and eventually rebranded themselves as ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria.
And just when you think the board couldn't get more crowded, Turkey gets heavily involved in 2015.
Yes, but their main priority wasn't even toppling Assad or fighting ISIS.
Right, they were primarily focused on launching airstrikes against Kurdish populations in northern Syria. But wait, why focus on the Kurds when there's a dictator dropping bombs and ISIS building a caliphate next door?
Because the Kurds were trying to use the chaos of the civil war to carve out an independent, self-governing region of Kurdistan along the Turkish border.
Ah, I see.
Turkey has a long history of conflict with Kurdish separatists inside its own borders, and they viewed a contiguous, armed Kurdish state right next door as an existential security threat. So they entered the war to ensure that didn't happen.
The sheer number of conflicting agendas is just dizzying. While these superpowers are locked in their own strategic chess matches, what is actually happening to the civilians on the ground?
It's horrific.
This multinational brawl pushed the Assad regime to extreme measures to maintain its grip on power. The brutality peaked between 2012 and 2013. In July 2012, there was a massive explosion in Damascus that killed Assad's brother-in-law, who was also the defense minister.
And Assad's response was a scorched earth policy against rebel strongholds.
Even with all his military might and Iranian backing, Assad couldn't completely crush the rebellion because of the constant flow of external support to the rebels, so he escalated to the unthinkable.
In August 2013, the regime launched a chemical weapons attack on the Ghouta region of Damascus using sarin gas.
Which is just an incredibly cruel nerve agent. It fundamentally attacks the nervous system by inhibiting the enzyme that turns off muscle contractions.
The victims' muscles constantly fire, meaning they literally cannot breathe out.
Thousands of civilians, including hundreds of children, violently convulsed and suffocated in their sleep or choked to death in the streets.
It's one of the darkest moments of the entire war.
With over 180 countries strictly banning chemical weapons, how did the international community allow a literal war crime to go unpunished simply because of bureaucratic vetoes?
It highlights the grim, deeply cynical reality of international law versus geopolitical alliances. Human rights groups and the United Nations wanted to refer this atrocity to the International Criminal Court. Chemical weapons are supposed to be the ultimate international red line.
Right, everyone thought this was the definitive end for Assad.
But Russia and China used their veto power in the UN Security Council to block any legal accountability. Contrast the physical horror of a child suffocating from nerve gas with a diplomat in a suit sitting in New York, raising his hand to veto an intervention.
It's sickening. In fact, the sources show that between 2011 and 2017, Russia used its veto 7 different times to protect the Syrian government from international sanctions or military intervention.
Without that diplomatic shield from Russia, the Assad regime almost certainly would have collapsed under global pressure.
So the UN is functionally paralyzed. The U.S., under Obama, does launch some targeted airstrikes, but they are incredibly careful not to get drawn into a war with Assad.
Right.
They focus almost exclusively on defeating ISIS, which had, evolved into a global terror threat by then.
Right. And years later, President Trump attempts to pull U.S. forces out entirely, but is forced back into active military strikes by yet another regime chemical attack in 2017.
Throughout all this unimaginable violence, we are witnessing a totally new phenomenon in modern warfare. Traditional journalism became almost impossible in Syria.
It was a death sentence.
The regime and extremist groups actively targeted reporters, resulting in over 800 journalists killed. So the various factions turned directly to the internet.
It was the first true social media war. Everyone, the regime, the rebels, ISIS, was using platforms like Twitter and YouTube to recruit, to spread their own propaganda, and to broadcast their highly curated version of the truth.
At the same time, citizen journalists posting videos from their cell phones became the world's only window into the unfiltered horror of what was actually happening on the ground.
And what those cell phone videos captured was a country reduced to a skeleton of rubble. Ancient historical cities entirely destroyed, schools and hospitals systemically erased.
Just one man clinging to power, entirely willing to burn his own nation to the ashes just to keep his seat.
The human toll of this conflict is almost impossible to comprehend. Over 400,000 people dead. 80% of the remaining population living in extreme poverty, struggling daily just to find bread.
And millions of people fleeing the country, risking their lives on overcrowded boats in the Mediterranean, drowning by the thousands because they literally have no other choice but to run.
And when you trace the line of all this devastation all the way back, it loops right back to Daraa.
Yeah. Moyes Yasna, the 14-year-old boy who just wanted to write a rebellious message on a school wall, is now a grown man. And he is still fighting as a rebel against the exact same government that tortured his friends over a decade ago.
It's a sobering reality.
So what does this all mean? When you look at this deeply, it shows you the unimaginable, terrifying butterfly effect of a single action. One kid with a can of spray paint, and a decade later, the world is fundamentally altered.
It really is. And as we look at the ruins of Syria today, this raises an important question, something for you to mull over long after we wrap up here.
What's that?
What happens to the future of a nation when an entire generation's only coming-of-age experience, their only education, is a brutal, seemingly endless war that was originally sparked by a teenage prank? How do you ever begin to rebuild a functional society when trauma has become its primary export?
It's hard to even fathom. A school wall, a spray can, and a broken nation. We'll leave you with that thought.